Campside Media.
Hey, Campside listeners, welcome back to Inside the Tent, our show where we go behind the scenes of our favorite podcasts and talk to the people who brought them to life. My name is Adam Hoff, and I'm one of the co-founders at Campside. Today I'm talking to Vanessa about Run, Bambi, Run. Run, Bambi, Run is a classic stranger-than-fiction saga complete with murder, scandal, and a prison escape, all set in a tumultuous 1980s Milwaukee. But it's also a very nuanced story about a single character, Laurie Bembenek, aka Bambi, who is hard to reduce down to an archetype. I'm really looking forward to talking to Vanessa about the long journey to bring this one to life. To get more content or behind-the-scenes anecdotes from our shows, make sure to go to joincampside.com to become a free member of the Campside community. That's joincampside.com. Well, we obviously go way back on this one, Vanessa. We decided to do it together. We pitched and sold it to Apple together. And then, well, actually, I guess that's where our paths diverged because you made the podcast and I just listened to it. So I guess
there was a 2-year period in there.
Where, so that part was important, you're saying? I just remember it as us doing it together. But no, I mean, that's the part I've always wanted to hear more about because I know the story well. And I'm obviously working on the adaptation now, trying to produce that. But that whole journey you went on, I think, is a little bit of a black box to me. So certainly would be to fans of the show. I think to start, it is interesting to talk about how this one began, right? It's different than a lot of our projects. So tell people how this one came together and kind of came about.
Yeah, I mean, you were also instrumental, so you can put your 2 cents in. But we thought of this project because we realized it was an incredible story that hadn't been told in many, many years with a killer part really for an actress at the center, which is like this woman whose name is Bambi Bembenek. Her real name is Laurencia, which just really rolls off the tongue, had this life where she was not only a Playboy bunny, she was not only a Milwaukee cop, she was not only indicted for her husband's ex-wife's murder, she was convicted for that murder. Then she got out of jail somehow. She escaped from jail and she really went on the run. And then she turned into this massive folk hero because people thought she wasn't alive. And we'll talk about what happened after that, which, is quite the denouement. But she has this amazing story. And the truth is, Adam, you're the one who found this. And you're the one who identified that this was a story that needed to be told.
Well, kind of you to say, slightly inaccurate, only in the sense that Kyle Long, a friend of Campside, a screenwriter, is the one who had found it. And then I was introduced to him and he was like, listen, I have this thing I was developing for TV. Mm-hmm. It seems like you'd make a great podcast, right? And this was at the time when a lot of projects were being reverse engineered, I guess you could say, in that way. And it was interesting to me because I had never heard of it at all. Like I'd literally never heard of this story, but it definitely, as soon as you even Googled it, you're like, oh, this was like a rip from the headline story. It's just from a generation back, right? So it was interesting to go find a story that today there'd be 10 versions of it being made. And instead, because it was multiple decades back, there was only, say, 3 versions being made, right? So it was just interesting to explore it from that standpoint. I mean, was it different for you? Was it harder to have TV people like driving this and sending it to you and kicking it off? Or did it basically unfold the same way from there?
Well, first of all, I appreciate the story tip, because the most important thing for us at Campside when we're making limited series is that there's like an incredible character at the center and there's enough twists and turns. And I think from the personality I just laid out, that you can assume some things happened around those changes in her life that were interesting. And so that's like half the work that, I do and Josh Ian and Matt Scher and lots of other people on staff do, which is just look around and be like, does that story actually work at 4 to 5 hours? But yeah, the difference here is I'd never heard of the story either because it happened in the early 80s, which, I was alive. You were also alive, but we were not in any way, shape, or form watching the tabloid press or even made for TV movies, which is where this story lived. Then after we sold it to Apple, I had to actually go out and figure out how do I report this? And the interesting thing about reporting, which I think really I learned from this experience making this podcast, I never done something that was this historic before, is stories only last a certain amount of time. When the people who are in the stories are sick or dying, something like this starts to disappear before your eyes. And that's sort of what we figured out, because we made this big list of all the people who were important. The person who got Bambi kicked off the police force because she was smoking a joint at like a Rufus and Chaka Khan concert, and that got Bambi in trouble. Well, we tried to reach that woman. I even knocked on her door when I was out in the field, and they were like, yeah, no, she is dead. Like, she's been dead for several years. I was like, well, but it's so important that I interview her for this podcast. And that was just not happening. So that was the real test of metal here. Amazing idea, totally going to work at length. Can we actually make the podcast with people just dropping like flies as we went to interview them?
Well, you're touching on something interesting, because you thanked me for the tip on this call. But if I remember correctly, back then you were cursing my name. I think you said you'd never forgive me for sending you this one.
No.
And it was because of that, right? There was just no leads to follow. So how did you work around that? Obviously, I know some of the answers to that because of how it turned out. But for people who don't know the process, what do you do when there's no one to interview and the medium of limited series podcasting relies on what we call tape? What'd you do?
Right. So, I mean, this was so extreme. I want to explain that the guy who helped her break out of jail, the two of them got married. We had contacted him on Facebook, and then he just didn't write back and didn't write back. And we realized he was in his last days dying. Like, we couldn't say to him, hey, by the way, can you just do an interview for this podcast while you're in hospice? So that's how extreme some of the reporting challenges were. I did go through like a dark night of the soul for a few months where I was like, can we actually do this? But we just kept pushing and pushing and making lists of people. And we did end up getting critically some of the women who had been on the police force with Laurie, one of which who had been also summarily told to get off the force and had been treated horribly and sent out into the field totally alone in hopes that perhaps something would happen to her. So we just like pushed and pushed. And then the other thing is, got our hands on all the documents, all the legal documents, all the clips, all the trial transcripts, books. Chris Radish, who's an amazing writer, had a book that she had written about Laurie. Laurie had written her own book. And I, not to toot my own horn, but I do like shine in situations like that because I just love color so much that I speed read whatever I can just for color. And so it's like, oh my God, there's one tiny sentence I can pull out of this 1,000-page document. Wow, it was worth it for me. So it was just like grabbing color all over the place. And we interviewed a lot of journalists from the time, which is what you do when you can't get the main people. And hats off to Mark McAdam, who really did a soundtrack for this that's just unbelievable and worked with me for sure on a lot of the writing and trying to bring out the best details we had because we just didn't have that many details.
Well, I do think you're hitting on something, though, which is it was a very stylized podcast. And I think people who are obsessed with the way they're typically done maybe were thrown by that. But people who don't have a familiarity, maybe their prominent storytelling medium is a novel or a TV show or something. I think people loved this show in part because it was all in the writing and all in the design. And obviously you're an extremely talented writer. And so did you feel like that was fun for you? Oh, did it almost turn into like, hey, I actually am almost writing a novel in a sense? Did it sort of trip at any point where you're saying, oh, this is actually better for me, I'm in the space I want to be in? Or was it constantly just trying to make it work?
No, I think it did get fun. And I think there's parts that were fun, like writing about the police force and Harold Breyer, who was the chief of police at that time, who was this Gestapo level guy, was really fun. And finding out all the like historic details, it definitely tripped. I think that the last episode was the most fun for me to write because it was reflection on what had happened and almost my reflection on like this lengthy experience we had gone through, putting it together and trying to figure out the meaning of it. And, what I mentioned at the beginning is Laurie actually became an alcoholic, drug user, through yet another crazy series of events, ended up losing her leg, dying very early. And I'm not one of these people who's like, this person must get justice. But I did feel a real responsibility at that point to bring her story to the fore, because she was like done dirty in a lot of different ways and met this very ignominious and early end. So I felt very both emboldened and enlivened by the story itself.
It's occurring to me as we're talking about this, we often forget about this part of the process. And I think people listen to the show probably honestly assume that we decide to make something a certain way and then we just make it. But obviously, there's partners on these. And significantly, Apple TV Plus was the distributor and the financier and the producing partner of this show. And, a friend of Campside, Kyle Wasserman, who runs their podcast program over there, I know really loves your approach. And did that help as well? Did having somebody who is like, I love what you're doing, keep going. Did you get sort of
Oh,
a
yeah.
feeling that that you needed a green means go from him? And when did that happen?
Yeah, I think that happened at different points through the process. But yeah, they were so supportive. They loved the show. They loved the character and the meta text of it, and the fact that it was a feminist story that had been lost to time, because what you do realize is Laurie is sort of a hero, even though she was painted and tarred and feathered and everything had happened to her. All these different illusions of who she was had been in the eyes of different people as she went through her life. We were telling what we believed to be the true story. So yeah, I think they were amazing partners.
And you mentioned Chris Radish, who was a journalist as well and had written a book about Laurie. And she was somebody we were introduced to by Kyle Long, the screenwriter who brought us the project. And she was a resource that you used. Talk about how you engaged with Chris and how you utilized her in this process.
Yeah, I mean, I went to Asheville and hung out with her in her little lesbian fantasy world that she has created after she was married to somebody, bad marriage. And in Milwaukee, she ended up becoming a person who loves to hike and writes novels. And she lives in Asheville and is a really spiritual person. So she had befriended Bambi when she was in prison, Laurie when she was in prison, and was one of many women who took up the mantle to say, wait, this woman is in prison and shouldn't be. And we don't think she really did this. We think she was framed by, basically the Milwaukee Police Department or certain people. That is a bit of a mystery. And even so many years later, thinks of it as one of the great highlights of her life. So it was fascinating to talk to her about the parts that she remembered, which, some of the stuff she also didn't remember. So it was like time was sort of passing, even as I was talking to her, who was like the ultimate expert. And she would joke, like, everybody wants to talk to me because I'm the last one alive. It's like, well, there is some truth to that. But she's an amazing person in addition to that, like a great personality.
Yeah, no doubt about that. And was that personality the reason that you decided, and I assume early on, to put her in the story as a character rather than have her be a resource behind the scenes?
I did. I mean, I love doing behind the curtain glimpses in my storytelling. Like, I think it's fun to show people, how did you get this story? In the first episode of this podcast, you hear me go and meet her in Asheville and go in her garage, which she calls like the kingdom of crap, and try to pull out all her boxes that she had of Laurie stuff. And she actually had all of these letters that the two of them wrote to each other over years and years when she was in prison. And reading those letters was one of the big breakthroughs that I had, because remember, I'm a pretty skeptical person. So you tell me this person's a feminist icon, I'm going to really check that out and see if that's true. And there was part of me that was like, yeah, okay, now she's in prison. I mean, people do this a lot. They say like, oh, well, I'm in prison. Who will help me? Oh, the ladies, they're going to help me, right? Hey, I want out of here. Hey, ladies, I didn't do it, And reading those letters, like the genuine personality that came through of Bambi Laurie was so vivid, and it was so clear that this wasn't just her game. Like, let me see what activists will take care of me here. So that was a major breakthrough for me to be there with her. In terms of like whether it works for the series or not, yeah, I mean, I think there's probably arguments that can be made that more linear storytelling works. But I think at Campside generally, we really pride ourselves in doing a lot of reporting, and that texture is part of so many of our podcasts.
I thought it worked great. And that garage scene that you're talking about, it sticks with me. It's one of my favorites, right along with the opener. I loved when you depicted the police chief perfecting what I guess you could call diversity laundering.
Yeah,
The
exactly.
way he would hire people to hit a quota, then immediately get rid of them. And then, of course, like Disco Fred stands out in my mind. And I think using those kinds of names and that kind of cheeky tone, the way you'd introduce characters with a real flourish, was that going to be embedded in this the whole time? Was that a choice you made so that you could keep track of all these people? Like, when did you decide to kind of shorthand characters and give them their own little intros, I guess you could say?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's partly because the reporting was so hard and it wasn't there. So you have to make people sound vivid in the writing if you're not going to have these people actually talking to you, right? Because, like, in most podcasts, you're like, oh, now here's the person, the witness who heard and saw all the things, and I'm hearing their voice, and I can sort of draw a mental picture of who this person is by the person's voice, right? Like, that's the pleasure of podcasting. It's like I spent so long as a print writer where you're goosing these scenes and trying to make them pop in people's minds. And now you just get to play the tape and you're like, everybody just gets to hear what I heard, right? That's so cool. That's what's so cool about podcasting. Like, I'm bringing you right there. But here, yeah, I think it did dawn on me at some point, like, okay, everybody's got to have a nickname or some sort of stylized way of remembering who this person is, or the writing's just not going to pop and the story's not going to make that much sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it worked. It's certainly memorable, and people still refer to those characters in those ways. So it obviously was very effective. There's one thing I always wanted to ask you, and so this is a great opportunity to do it. Obviously, we assume people have listened to the story, but the basic bones of it is that Laurie became a police officer in Milwaukee, was pretty quickly drummed out, and then ended up having this whole ordeal happen where she was accused and convicted for murder. But that first beat where she goes and becomes a police officer, it feels like the motivation for doing that has been hard to access. Did you feel that way? Is it one of those cases where in fiction you'd give her this incredible motivation, but in true life it's simpler or maybe more complex? How did you grapple with explaining why she did this to begin with?
Well, I think we came up with a few different theories, but yeah, I agree. They're not all that satisfying. I mean, the first one is just like the Charlie's Angels theory. Like, it was cool to be a cop. People were down with doing it. Like, women were trying to get more power and jobs that were men's. And so this was one of them, and it seemed glamorous because of Charlie's Angels. Then the other one is just she just likes to put on uniforms because at that point she'd already been like Miss March because she was a model, right? Like in a Schlitz company brewing calendar, which is like one of the great Americana flourishes in the show. And she was working in department store windows, putting clothes on people. She liked the uniform. She did sew her own uniform to be a little more form fitting or something. So that was like one theory, very hard to wrap your head around. And then the other one was just that her dad had been a cop. And there's a lot of like, well, he didn't really like it. He thought they were corrupt. He ended up becoming a carpenter contractor guy. But he was a cop. She grew up all around cops, like on her block, everywhere. And she knew these people. And then the last one is just like, she was really into guys. She had a lot of boyfriends. She was super into going out and dating, and she might have thought this might be kind of fun to be around all these guys. She wasn't fearful of it. It didn't have negative connotations. Wait, and there is one more, because as you know, we have talked about this, but like, she played the flute. She was sort of a rule follower in some ways, and she liked to break rules, but she was like a straight A student. There was always this toggling in her between, I want to get the straight A's and I want to mess up the system. So maybe that straight A part had momentarily won out.
Yeah, it's interesting. You hit on so many possible theories. And in that, I think also captured all these multitudes she contained. I think that's what's so fascinating about the story. And also what I loved about you telling is you were sort of unafraid of confronting all those. You weren't trying to make it one tidy thing. Do you feel like that's what people got wrong about Laurie for a long time, is that they wanted her to be just one thing, like really easy to understand? Because it seems like her story was hard to nail down, despite how many people took a shot at telling it.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think she was pegged as a femme fatale because of her looks. I mean, the interesting thing about this is also like, I have a friend who was quite beautiful, and she would always talk about it as like pretty girl problems. Pretty girl problems are a little different than not pretty girl problems. And your life is in some ways better, easier, just the way that like men who are taller tend to get to be president or whatever those things are that just like exist in our society. But this really flipped around and gave her serious problems, right? Her looks in the end, that's what really damned her, is that it made people just think there's no way a beautiful woman like this could be innocent of this murder charge. There must be something wrong with her. She must be evil. So that's what they reduced her to, is like killer bunny, right? She was a Playboy bunny. She's hot. She's a killer. This is like a 5 o'clock afternoon movie for retirees to sink their teeth into and think somebody is bad in the world. And she also was really smart. So she was too pretty and too smart for that moment, I think.
Right. Now, obviously, part of the reason it's tempting to get reductive about it is because there is this just blatant and omnipresent misogyny through the story, right? From the police department to the press. When you're grappling with a story that has that so central, is it ever tempting to leave the narrative and really hammer a theme, or do you just let the story speak for itself?
I'm a big show don't tell person. I think that it's not worth it to hammer it home for people. Like, they should be able to put this together on their own. So yeah, we just did touches. I mean, we probably could have gone further, but also while we were making it, we were trying to figure out if she really was innocent. In the end, we do believe she was innocent, but like, I really had to be convinced. It's like, there's this, could they really have gotten this wrong?
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, last question for you, which is, when you're doing a story like this, and you mentioned it took 2 years to basically execute, do you find that it stays with you afterwards? Do you want it to? Do you leave it all behind so you can clear the RAM, so to speak, in your brain for the next one? Like, how do you engage with these stories once they're done?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting because in podcasting, I find that if you don't actually think about the story, you'll forget it. Whereas in print, I would never read one of my articles after it came out. It would just be too painful. Like, oh my God, why did I write that way? But in podcasting, you do have to keep thinking about it or it'll just fly out of your mind. Whereas print, you sort of remember it from going through that experience. I definitely felt like the bruised warrior at the end of this. I'm like, I can't believe we actually pulled this off. And I'm really proud of it. I think it's an amazing podcast. And again, like, a lot of that is due to Mark. The stylization, as you mentioned, that wouldn't have sounded that way. But I wouldn't say like I think and dream about it, but it's something that I think about with a lot of fondness. So all's well that ends well.
Yeah, well, same here. I think of it fondly as well, and proud of the work that you did and that the whole team did. So thanks for taking people through it.
Yeah, and thanks for the tip.
Yeah, well, now we say that.
Yeah.
Thanks so much to Vanessa and the rest of the Run Bambi Run team. Big thanks to Kyle Long, who first brought us this amazing story, and to Kyle Wasserman at Apple, who commissioned and supported it, and to any other Kyles who helped out. And of course, thank you for listening to Inside the Tent. If you haven't already, don't forget to go to joincampside.com to become a free member of the Campside community. That's joincampside.com.